Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Living Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Today, we have a very interesting show because we're going to speak about the origins of life or our individual lives embodied on Earth. And I'm talking about here the birth process. And I have a guest, Eyla Cuenca, who has a very interesting life path that led her to the world of being a doula and a lactation consultant. And she has expertise in all the areas really related to getting pregnant, having a baby, and taking care of your children. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Ayla.
Hi, thank you for having me. Really happy to be here.
Fantastic. So, Ayla, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you got into this area. And I noticed that we both worked with children who were kind of in the system, so to speak, who were traumatized, neglected, or orphaned, or had other life circumstances that maybe led to foster care and placement and delinquency and things like that. And it's a very traumatizing and high stress field and type of work to do. And it's very difficult to make progress and do what's right. So how did that springboard you, into the world of childbirth, and what were your experiences like doing that work?
Yeah, I had two starkly different, like contrasting experiences, right? Because I studied anthropology focusing in family systems and really getting this kind of picture of like how a successful system moves forward, like how it's operating day to day, right? If we're looking at these like smaller tribal structures. And then I went right out of that into working with the 11th Judicial Circuit in Florida, actually as a volunteer guardian at Lightem. And so I went from this kind of like idyllic perspective on like how we should be into like what is. and and I remember I had a caseload of about three foster children at once, and I was just a volunteer, right? I went through a training to be able to hold this space and visit these homes, write these reports, and then, subsequently provide them to the judge and the attorneys involved in the case. And so it's like they were so overloaded with children who needed this kind of space holding and support that they would have a volunteer doing what I consider to be really like high stakes work. Um, and I remember this particular scenario where I went into one of the homes and this little girl, she was about 4. And when I walked into the front door, I saw that her biological mother was jumping out of the window in the back room. I saw the mother leaving, and the mother actually, they have a restraining order against the mother, so the mother was not supposed to be there. And I went out the front door to kind of see who it was to confirm, and it was her, and she was crying, And I left there deeply disturbed from the experience because I realized that what this mother really wanted was to be with her child, but she didn't have the tools or the resources to even like do that. Like she didn't know how to do that, and life had taken some turns and she wasn't even able to see her. And so I drove home that day wondering, like, what is the solution? Like, it's not more funding, it's not more guardian ad litems, it's not more like community resources or whatever that means, to support this program, and like kind of band-aid after the fact, right? It was like, how do we get to the core of this issue? And that's when I started receiving, I guess, like downloads in meditation and starting to see that I had to go back to the source, which was the birth, which was the pregnancy, which was like even the lineage of the woman before her getting pregnant, to really understand how we could like start to create the conditions for her to have a more conscious, supported
Right.
experience, regardless of where she lives, who she is, what community she's a part of. Like, this was just where I needed to move. So that's how I transitioned into birth work and
Right.
birth
This is
education.
fascinating, Ayla. And it's also, I would wonder, for kids in those situations who are experiencing that, how many of those times did the parents sit down in advance and plan to, start a family or expand their family? When I was working in a residential placement, and it was all adolescents, and they were put there. Many of them were not in their parents' custody. Some of them were, right? But all of them came from very toxic and sick families in terms of their emotional health and their productivity and safety and all of these issues. And they basically identified one kid in the family who was acting out and probably got in trouble in school or maybe with the police in the neighborhood, with some vandalism or things like that, and take that kid right out of that, which is probably a relief for the kid in many ways, although it's still their family, they identify with them. And, just focus on that kid. And then at the end, put them back right in the same. It's like, why don't they have the whole family, come and learn how to be a family and how to deal with their individual issues? And then when they leave, there's a chance that they could all actually have a somewhat of a healthy family. But of course, it would be better to start before there's there's the
Oh,
family.
I mean, isn't that like conventional psychiatry too? It's like just pinpointing one dimension of the human rather than like the holistic approach, you know? Like,
Well, I mean, it definitely in terms of psychiatric medications, it's pretty much encourage you to just forget about whatever's going on in your life, not work on it and develop yourself, but just tolerate it, in a semi-zombie state. So
yeah,
that's definitely true. But there are people, even in conventional mental health, who do take a different approach, right, with psychotherapy. They're just very rare. And the system makes it, I mean, I'm sure this is why you knew you had to leave, right? Because having more, good-hearted guardian ad litems or more good-hearted psychotherapists, it's not going to change the system,
right.
right? Because it's built essentially to have a certain type of outcome, and you can't really change it from the bottom.
Right. Yeah, and that was kind of like my homecoming was attending that first birth, and it happened very fluidly, right? Where I just said I'm going to start attending births, and I had a an ethnographic photography background. That was the path that I was on, and so all of these things
So
had
was
happened.
that like photographing the tribes in Africa, like
Yeah,
on National Geographic?
right. Basically, like my dream was to travel the earth plane with an anthropologist and like photograph their research. And that's somehow like somewhat why I ended up at the 11th Judicial Circuit was actually photographing high profile cases. So I was working in the publications department and then started doing the guardian ad litem work. And then that's when it kind of like transitioned into birth work, and things started to become really clear to me, you know. And then I started doing birth education. I trained with Dr. Bradley, or under Dr. Bradley. He's since passed away, but that was when I started to see that there was this whole underbelly of the birth industry, you know, and women essentially, like what I considered at the time, you know, women being bamboozled by the system. And as I've come to learn 10 years, 11 years later, it's really no one's like tricking anyone. It's just like we are choosing not to see what's right in front of us. You know, we're
Ayla,
choosing.
I'm so glad that you coined that term, the birth industry, right? Because really it is the commercial interests of hospitalizing and medicalizing birth, right? Which is not an illness or a disease.
Right,
But they
exactly.
they incorporate it in the disease model, and I'll just give you a brief example that you may know of. But I had, you know, both of my first two kids were home births with a midwife, and the midwife showed me that the ACOG, right, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and that's like the professional organization for obstetricians. They put out a position paper saying that home births were not safe, and it referenced this article that was published right in a scientific paper. But and the article had all of these, because there are really large studies on home birth outcomes, like from Europe, where they have, socialized medicine. So that means they have the health records of everyone in the nation on a computer, so they can do all this analysis, right? And all these studies showed that home birth had better outcomes.
Mhm.
But so they said they included these, and then in, like, one little sentence, they all were disqualified, and they only cherry picked like a very
Mhm.
tiny number of very small studies with,
Yeah, to
like,
support their
and
position.
and ignored all of the data, and then their position exactly was, you got to come to us because we're the only game in town.
Right. And I mean, it started right in the 1890s where hospitals were like, who has a need every single day? Because, like, people aren't necessarily breaking their legs every day. They don't need their appendixes removed every day. So, um, what can we do? Oh yeah, birth. Women are giving birth every day. And so they developed these like wings in the hospital where they were advertising, pain-free, non-messy births, and so women could go there and get knocked out. Dr. Bradley called it the knock 'em out, drag 'em out era of birth, right? You can knock the woman
Right,
out.
that's right, because they gave general anesthesia back then. There were
Right.
no epidurals, right? You were knocked out unconscious.
Yeah, and I think which queen was it? Queen Victoria had, she made a public statement about chloroform. She was like, "I wouldn't do this without chloroform," and so it was
That's
like
right.
all the rage in England, and then in Newark, New England hospitals, they started doing the general anesthesia, and women could have the baby, born, be born, and then there would be nurses and staff to clean everything up, and they would get food, and the baby would get taken care of and fed, and that's kind of where the formula industry found its entry point as well. And so I know I keep using the word industry, but we start to see how all of these different producers had opportunities, not only the producers of these medications or these drugs, I should say, but also formula. And there were more jobs created because of this, right? So the midwife had been slowly edged out for some time in Western Europe, and then for sure, in America in the 1890s, early 1900s. So there's always been this push to say we're the only game in town. And once we did this crossover where birth kind of went into the existential fear category, right, where we started bringing it into this, like, it's an emergency, it could be dangerous. That's when people really started to feel like, I need them, I need this, I need the institution in order for me to have this thing that I really want, which is to have a family. So they found a way to kind of lock into a woman's deepest desire, not only emotionally but biologically, right? Because to reproduce is our way of survival. It's our way to access immortality. And so when a woman is, it's kind of threatened, she'll go to wherever they're telling her it's going to be successful, which is the hospital. Um,
No,
so
you're absolutely right. It's so fear-based. When I was in medical school, I had to um, spend time in obstetrics. And you would think it would be, it's something that you look forward to, maybe the chance of helping to deliver a baby. And, it should be a good thing. Like, you came from the cancer ward the month before, and, and it was the most miserable experience
is it
because,
like generally dreaded by your classmates? Like, what it like is that kind of the thing, like the word on the
well,
street is
I
like, we don't want
mean,
to go to obstetrics?
there are like the people in my class that were interested in birth and pediatrics and that aspect of medicine, so they were excited about it. But the personalities of the residents and the attendings were so toxic. I
Mm,
mean, the meanest women I've ever met were obstetricians, I swear. And everything was, like, you don't know what you're talking about, get out of there. And they would poke and prod at these women constantly, and then argue about, like, they would all disagree about the amount of dilation, and act like the other one didn't know what they were doing and all this kind of stuff. And be going back and forth to the operating room doing C-sections all day. I mean, it evolved to the point where many, not the kind of women that I saw in my um education, but wealthy women were like scheduling their births,
right.
right, surgically.
Yeah.
And that's how far we've gotten from nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting you made that observation about the women who work in obstetrics, because it's like the ultimate gaslight, right? Like your body isn't doing what you feel that it's doing. Or like what you're feeling right now is not what's actually happening, because like from my like super subjective like traumatized projection, like it's like, but that's so much of the projection of the inner girl who was hurt or gaslit for whatever reason about her body, and then goes into this field where she then, like, the victim becomes the abuser, if we're looking at the family constellation framework. And it's like so many of these women have sustained some sort of gaslight or trauma around their body, and then they have a desire to want to support the woman in her process, but then this unhealed part comes out, and it's like exercising control and denying her reality, and ultimately going into a C-section because there's no way to stay present with the challenge of an unplanned labor, an uncontrollable labor. All you can do is surrender and allow it to unfold, but that doesn't work for their system, right? They can't handle that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just occurred to me as you were describing that the fear was there on the side of the doctors too, that if they, that they didn't trust their skills or nature for everything to go okay. And they're like, oh, well, if, we know if we do a C-section, everything is bulletproof. But, if we don't deliver correctly, like if we, if the baby comes out head first or a footling or, breach in some way, or there's, shoulder dystocia, they just like, all they see is, oh, I'm out of business, I'm going to be sued. And it is true in some places, the
Yeah.
liability is incredible. Like actually where you are, Florida is one of the worst places for malpractice liability. At one point, I thought about relocating there and talked to some doctors, and they said that they basically put all their assets in Cayman Islands offshore accounts so that they can't be seized, because it's not a matter of if they'll be sued for malpractice, it's a matter of how many times a year.
When? Yeah, it's about when. No, that's a really good tip, though. Thanks for sharing. I'll let the midwives know. There's like definitely a statewide witch hunt with midwives, and they actually, the state, was it almost 3 years ago, raised the malpractice insurance for anyone who is claiming to be able to do VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean.
Yeah.
And now pretty much every midwife I know cannot afford that insurance, so she can no longer offer home birth after cesarean, or vaginal birth after cesarean. So women are getting corralled back to the hospital to attempt vaginal birth after cesarean, which isn't impossible in a hospital, but I feel it's much more challenging considering everything she's up
You,
against.
yeah. You have to
Yeah.
tell them you had appendicitis and it wasn't a C-section.
Yeah. The scars are right above the pubic bone, but they've figured out how to get the appendix. Yeah,
I had it done in Brazil. They preserve your bikini line there.
exactly. No, it's really, no, it's a good, there's a way around it, I'm sure. Um,
Well, just have the baby yourself.
just have the baby yourself. Exactly. Yeah, it's just since that moment of deciding to go into doula work and holding that space for women, um, what I started to see is just there was a lack of trust in her own body, right? It was like, well, how could I, and maybe I will, but for the second birth. But since it's my first birth, I'll do this in the hospital just to be safe. And so I started to see, as I was holding space for women in their labor, that the deeper work was looking at what is the holding back, what is the lack of capacity to surrender, where are we not able to trust. And then that opened up a whole can of worms, looking at a woman's history, her own birth, when she was born from her mother, looking at her relationship dynamics, looking at, it just became this much bigger experience. And so as I started to develop what now is the doula training that I offer, I started to, like, as I wrote the curriculum, it was so much about holding a space for a woman as she starts to come back to herself, right? So it's like half of the training is normal physiological birth, interventions, emergencies, lactation, kind of all of those things that you would typically expect a doula to be able to support you with. But then the other half of it is holding space for the revelation, and the journey that a woman can go through, and the homecoming she can have if she's willing to, you know.
I think that's really critical because I have seen the feminine wisdom come out in these situations. Of course, it requires not giving into the fear and the pressure from the family and everything like that. But you know, it's such a natural process, and how could we not have it in us? Because we would be extinct.
Absolutely. I
Right?
mean, Dr. Bradley used to say he grew up on a farm in Kansas, so he just watched animals give birth all the time. And then when it wasn't successful, the very rare times he would say, it's just he would say survival of the fittest, right? That this was not meant to happen. And I know that's deeply triggering for a lot of people to hear because we somehow feel entitled to this experience of being alive and incarnated. We feel entitled to it. And so people didn't like that, but that's how he was able to get women to trust. He's also a very religious man, and so he really believed in God's will. Apart from being really involved with science and medicine, he was definitely a religious man, but he would help women get to that place of surrender by understanding that their body knows what to do without having to use the brain very much. They just have to allow their body to lead them in this process, and that things will work out. But we can't know the timing. And are we ready for any outcome? Do we accept any outcome, as it's presented to us? And so control, is a big factor in a woman's unbraiding process as she's going through her pregnancy, right? How do I plan, but how do I release control? How do I prepare without control? You know, so.
There's this misperception about the power of the health system to um, influence outcomes, right, in life or death situations. And you know we're all here temporarily in this experience, right, in this lifetime, and we're all going to die, and we can't really predict it unless we bring it about ourselves in some way. So going to the hospital to die is this is that's what the outcome is in nature. Now, certainly the hospital can cause deaths, but there really are almost no circumstances where they can prevent death.
Mhm.
And you might feel like, oh, well, we did everything we could, right? And it's up to them. But really, it's we have to just accept when things happen and when the time is the time. If your birth is has a serious problem, you'll know about it
Yeah.
because your experience, will bear it out. And there might be a time when you want to, seek emergency treatment, but almost always, things just work out, and any problems are only very minor.
Right. And like one common pathway to an emergency C-section that I've heard so often over the years of a woman who intended a home birth. Um, she was under the misconception that because she was working with a midwife and because she was at home, she didn't really have to prepare much. She didn't really have to come into her experience very much. She could kind of just show up and birth the baby. That can be true. However, when we have all these layers of like enculturation and fear, it would behoove us to work through that in the pregnancy, regardless of where we're birthing. And so not understanding basic energy conservation. So, she's laboring. It's been, almost 2 days of this kind of low grade labor, and she's exhausted. And so she burns out, decides she's going to tap out and go to the hospital. And so she gets an epidural and then, wants to rest, and everything slows down, spaces out. Her body starts to stall, what they would call stalled
Yeah,
labor.
of course.
So then she gets Pitocin, right? And this is like, for me, it's such a sharp 180, and we never know which way it's going to go with Pitocin. And so babies typically tend to react poorly to it. And so then the baby goes into distress, and now she's had an emergency C-section. And it's like, well, I planned a home birth. I did everything I could. And, sometimes I ask, well, did you? Like, what was the process? And they believe that there was no other way, right? That had she not gone to the hospital, then like none of this, the baby could be dead. But I always, right? So that's like once we get there, we've been saved, right? We've reached salvation, and then we're convinced that like without them it would have gone really wrong. But I asked them to consider, for the next one or whatever it is, and if you want to process this, like what were the steps you took to really step into the process besides just hiring a midwife and maybe reading a book or two, what was the actual preparation? So yeah, we hear all those stories where it's like, oh, she hadn't have been there, she would have died, the baby would have died. But I always like to reverse engineer how we got to that emergency C-section. And like, I don't want to throw a number out, but very often, most often, the woman could have prevented it.
Yeah, well, it's a snowball or an avalanche of interventions, right? Because as soon as you get into the hospital, they're already doing an intervention.
Yeah.
And, it may be for diagnostic purposes, but it has an influence, right? Even if it doesn't have a direct physical influence, it has an influence on, the mother's psyche and her energy, right? I mean, the nocebo effect is real, right? So when you get that fetal monitor and they tell you, oh, look at this, I found some, D cells or whatever. As soon as you hear that, you imagine the worst outcome,
Right.
and
And then you start to
even
really.
reading these are very subjective.
Right. Very subjective. And we, as the woman, as she takes that information and starts to like wrap herself in that warm blanket of the hospital support or what she perceives to be support, it's like we see this with pelvic exams as well, the internal exams, where it's like a woman will get examined by five different people over the course of her labor, and they're all
Yeah.
telling her that her cervix is a different dilation. So it's like,
Yes, yeah, just like I was mentioning, because they're just like they don't know, that they're not skilled.
no, and like one nurse's hand is half the size of the other nurse's hand. It's like, and everyone's just kind of guessing based on their own experience and what they thought they learned in school, and so they're taking this as like the word, right? The woman is taking it as
Yes.
the word. And so it creates a whole ripple effect. And suddenly she doesn't know anything about her body. Suddenly only everyone else does. Suddenly people she's never met before, know everything about her body and she knows
Right.
nothing.
And
So.
every woman I know who's given birth, knew when they went into active labor and were going to have the baby,
Right.
without anybody's exam telling them how dilated in the face they were.
Right. And so what women will ask me, how will I know when to push? And, how will I know when I need to leave for the hospital? How I know when I need to call the midwife? And I'm like, your body will just tell you, because if you're just in observation of your experience, your body leads you to where it needs to go. And that's really hard. I mean, how many women on a daily basis in their lives are actually so tuned in to their body that think about women, it's like they'll hold the need to urinate for like half an hour to 45 minutes because there's like other things to do. So like already there's this like
Yes.
overriding of the body's natural processes just to please or to get other things done. So she's deprioritized her body. And so learning to listen again is part of the work in the pregnancy that helps you have a more empowered birth experience, right? How many
Yeah.
of us were like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable in this situation, but I stay here and I grin and bear it so that, we get to the other side with results that I want. Even that, putting ourselves in uncomfortable social situations just to, I don't know, show face or whatever it is. But
Yeah, yeah. Our culture of, multitasking and, sitting in front of screens disconnects us from the natural communication from our body. It's, the same thing with this is why I see a lot of chronic dehydration because we lost
mm,
touch with the thirst mechanism. Uh,
mhm.
what do we have when we experience pain? Pain is information, right? Telling us something's wrong. We need to change or address something. But what do? We suppress it, right? With anti-inflammatories or pain relievers or alcohol or whatever, or distraction. And we're not in touch with these signals. So this is, something that affects every aspect of health, but certainly in the birthing aspect, right? You can go through a process where you can get back in touch with this. even food, right? We get signals to eat, right? But are they hunger or are they cravings, right? Are we feeding an
Right.
addiction or are we feeding, our body building blocks, for
Right. Right.
further development?
And is it auto regulation, right? It's like, am I just like with vape or with the scrolling or whatever it is, that's just the auto regulation to quell the pain or the deficit, the greater deficit that we're in, or is it conscious self-regulation? The difference.
So,
Yeah.
Ayla, can you tell us a little bit about how your course is structured, who it's for, and what their experience will be like?
Yeah, so what we have right now that's live every single year is the doula training. It's a birth worker training, and it's a 5 to 6 month container. And I've had all types of women come through this experience. Some women are acupuncturists, some of them are cognitive behavioral therapists, some of them have done other doula trainings and kind of like felt a little bit arrested in the moment of not knowing how to proceed, like not knowing how to alchemize all the information into an offering. And so this is really for anyone who wants to more consciously hold space for a woman's various initiations, right? From deciding to conceive to the pregnancy to actually birthing and then to having this new life with her. And so a lot of women will kind of find what speaks to them the most as they go through the training. Is it postpartum work? Is it working with a woman through a loss? Because women go through these losses as in this arc, in this initiation. And so some of the students feel really called to hold space for loss. I've had a few women leave the training and become death doulas. So they move on to say, like this is a space I really want to be in, this transition of life. And so I would say it's for anyone who is looking to up level, go deeper into their current practice, or they're like, you know what, I've had a few births and I really like valued the support I had so much, and now I want to learn how to offer that. And this is what women always did. It's inherent in our nature to want to hold that space. But what this can offer is a fine tuning of the skill while also unbraiding some of our own beliefs, because a lot of us hold limiting beliefs. Even if we're open to this, there's still some work to be done there. And so we have accountability in this training to help women get clearer boundaries, work through these embodiment practices, and also do some sister wound healing is what I call it, because we're in this space where everyone's working towards similar goals. And I've realized over the years that I've done this training that a lot of us come from this like zero sum mentality where it's like, if I'm doing this and she's doing this, like there isn't enough for me, And so there's also this kind of personal unbraiding of like abundance that can come through, like healing this abundance, or perception of lack of abundance. So it's a really multidimensional training. Most women say that their marriages improve after going through the training simply because they see their partners differently. They feel more positively polarized in their relationship. Some of them connect more with their children after this, because they've reconnected with their own inner girl, and so it becomes easier to connect with their children. So all kinds of beautiful magic
Right.
comes
So the
from.
opposite kind of side effects from pharmaceuticals. Here we get positive, unforeseen benefits. Now, do are there ever any men who take these courses?
I've never had a man inquire or come through, and I'm very like, I always speak to women when I talk about this. But I wonder how that would change the dynamic
Well, I
of the
think
group.
if there are any, men who are obstetricians, it would probably be good for them. Although
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
may not want them in there, but
I mean, they'll
well,
get
if they, of
perspective
course,
they've
if they
never
behave
gotten anywhere
themselves,
else.
if they're interested. Um, and what about women who are actually planning to become mothers? Would it be appropriate for them to study this?
Yes, I've had a few women who simply wanted to go through this training, not even with the intention to get the certification, but just to prepare themselves, for their own experience. One of them was already pregnant, and then the other one was planning to conceive, and they, I mean, they felt like it prepared them all the way through their early parenting. And so, yeah, those women are absolutely welcome. And then they have a community afterwards to continue to lean on. So we have our own private membership of everyone who's gone through the program. And we continue, business coaching support. We continue all of the workshopping around some challenges in working with certain clients. I mean,
Right.
anything that can come up. Like I found this placenta after I didn't find it, but it was given to me to prepare. But look at this. What do you think? And so we analyze photographs. We look at, and it's women all over the world, having these varied experiences as doulas, as space holders. So it's a very rich, really, really very rich program and membership.
Wow, it sounds pretty incredible. What type of commitment is it for the student while it's going on? Like, how much do they have to attend, or how many hours do they have to spend studying and such?
I would treat this as like something like a college course. So if that's something that feels like kind of familiar to you, look at it as something where you're dedicating about 8 hours a week, say to doing the home play and the work and the studying for the live classes, which happen every 2 weeks. So women certainly work full time and do this, and it feels pretty full for them. Some women are
Right, night
mothers.
school.
Yeah, pretty much. But what feels different about this is that there is a 24/7 chat that I'm involved in all the time. And so there's a lot of holding of the experience. And so when women say like the exercise we just did, like I feel like a lot is coming up for me. So we can do some processing on the side. So there's
So it's
always
like you're kind of modeling what you're teaching, right, by giving some of that to the students.
yes, yes.
That's a brilliant model. I really like
Exactly. Like,
that.
how do we get the blueprint for relationship? We don't get it. Like, if we don't get it from our parents, right? It's like, where do we get that blueprint? So I'm trying to offer this blueprint in the training so that they can say, oh, this is what it felt like to receive it. So now I can more actively, wholeheartedly offer it, you know? Um,
It's just
yeah.
so much more approachable too. I mean, because doing a professional level course could be intimidating, especially if you haven't done a formal education program in a while. But this is clearly a different sort of cultural experience than our accredited higher education systems.
Yes, totally. And no wokeness.
Is that on your application?
I mean, if it's not clear in the information that's made public, then I'm not sure how much more I can say it. But yeah, I we
Well, it's
typically
a
do.
good thing because if you're interviewing with me, then those people would not appreciate it.
I've been told by some of the graduates and some of the women who've entered the program that I'm the only we're the only training where they weren't required to give pronouns in the Zoom calls, and they, that
Wow.
kind of thing. And so I'm one of the only people who still refers to men and women in the birth world as men and women. I don't, say birthing person, which I guess is something that's really like pretty
Right,
prevalent.
because it's the one field where gender is the most obvious.
I mean, you would think.
How many men have you helped birth a baby?
It's wild what I see out there on social media, and what even midwives in the area, have changed their languaging to support a lot of the more liberal. I don't know if that's what we want to identity politics right now, but that have moved to Florida, and I'm not even. I don't get called by those midwives as much anymore because I won't do that one thing. Um, which
Wow.
is to say like the birthing person. Um, and to offer a pronoun, right? It's almost like an offering to this club that I just don't want to be a part
Do
of.
you find that there are a number of doulas that of this mindset who are working in the private, like they're not pursuing licensure or those kinds of contracts with the state?
Yeah, I'd say there are. And definitely the doulas that train with me, we do a lot of work around people pleasing and fawning. And so, um, I'll say, like, if this is how you feel, this is what you put out. You're the same person in this room as you are in that room. Like, that's the goal. And so if you start to change your languaging and the way you present in order to appease potential people, like, you're going to be mismatched, right? And now you're going to have to pretend. And so we work a lot around pretend and the game of pretend, and just really clarifying the voice that they want to have. And every woman's voice sounds different, and I'll say, like, you're going to get approached most likely by insurance companies who want to start to collect doulas so that they can manage how that doula works. And then, you'll think, wow, this is a great opportunity because I'm just guaranteed clients. But you're going to have to work within the parameters of their system.
Right.
And I've been approached by so many insurance companies over the last 6 years, and it's like they want to pay you $150 for doing, 4 months of work and attending a birth as a doula, but you're guaranteed a client, and it's like this whole thing. And so those women, those doulas, I find, are really just there to kind of work for the system and not necessarily for the woman. It's fine because they're energetically matched with a woman who is matched with the system. So it's like the doula matches with the client who matches with the system, and like they got their own party going on. But I really like my students to start to come into an awareness of, like, creating that, imagining the ideal client. And every time they get a client, they say, oh, I worked with this client and she was really a stickler about the contract and about the money and I'm like, okay, you're energetically matched to this woman. So, like, what do we need to work on right now? So, like, what is she showing you? And so we look at all these experiences as mirrors, and it's always about accountability. So every doula has to disabuse herself from the victim story, and it's very empowering for her. Right? How can she support a woman in an empowering birth experience if she's not personally empowered?
Of course. Of
You
course.
know? Yeah.
So simple and true, yet often just ignored
It's
completely.
uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable.
All right. Well, Ayla, it's really been a treat to talk about all of this, and to see a woman so energized and empowered to spread this message and help other women overcome, our cultural programming and some, very evil agendas that are popping up, in our modern existence. We will put information below about how you can learn more about this course and about Ayla's work and other platforms that she's on. And was there anything else you'd like to say
No,
before we
that's
finish
it.
up?
It's been a pleasure. I really have enjoyed speaking with you, and yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time on Healthy Living Interviews. Goodbye for now.